Okay, so week one in setting the scene in historical fiction. Again, I keep turning away to pick up my materials. I'm using the opening chapter for my first novel, Orphan Number 8, and you don't need to buy it. Again, the link is in our class and beneath the video. So in historical fiction, now everything is sort of happening all at once, so it's artificial to break it down this way, but as a way to kind of focus on some things, we're going to start with the idea of building the world of your scene. So a scene encompasses everything, and it's also written out of the words and the style, but your story is taking place somewhere. And in historical fiction in particular, that place and that time are really important aspects of the genre and what people are coming to the genre for. Little adjustment there. So again, using the opening scene of Orphan Number 8 just to provide you with some examples. The page numbers I have get like different by a line or two from the free online opening chapter, which is not numbered, but you can count out the pages and follow along that way. So we're going to look at some of the specific concrete details that build that scene. How do you select the details from all the research you did? How do you introduce the building blocks of your scene, the world? How do you describe them to your reader? And kind of, I don't know, the scope of your world so that you are bringing the reader to one specific time and place like this big, and you can't tell them everything in the universe. So understanding that and giving yourself permission, like, I don't have to explain everything. We are here. So Orphan Number 8, it's about an orphan. It's about a young girl named Rachel Rabinowitz, who is orphaned in 1919 and then grows up in the Orphaned Hebrews home, which was inspired by the Hebrew Orphan Asylum, which was a real place where my grandfather grew up, because my grandfather, as a 6-year-old, was not technically orphaned, but his father ran off and his mother couldn't afford to keep her children and work and take care of them all at the same time. And so she brought her 3 boys, to an orphanage, the Jewish orphanage in Manhattan, the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. That's how I started this whole journey to becoming a historical fiction writer. I was researching that family history, and it got to the point I started actually trying to do it as an academic project. I did a little bit in memoir writing. I never had quite enough to do full narrative history. I didn't want to get any more academic than I did a couple of proposals for the project as a kind of narrative history in an academic sense. And the feedback I got was it's not academic enough. I'm like, I don't want to get even more academic. And finally I was like, I have to write it as fiction because I'm super invested in the story, and there are all these little tidbits of things that I've learned that really happened, but overall, it's never going to be enough for me to say it's nonfiction or for me to say it's history. But if I do it as fiction, I can use all that research and all those things that I found so fascinating, but I can structure it as a story. And so that's how I came to write Orphan Number 8. I usually say I spent 5 years researching it, but it's probably more than that I was interested in the subject before I really tried to write it as a novel. And it was my first novel, so a lot of what I figured out about novel writing came through the many, many, many drafts of Orphan Number 8. And so what you have in front of you in terms of the opening scene, believe me, this is like years away from whatever first draft I came up with. And a lot of just figuring things out to get the chapter to where it is. So, building the world of your scene, world building in historical fiction, an idea that we're maybe more familiar with science fiction or speculative fiction. Even contemporary fiction, you have to build the specific world where in this vast world are we in terms of society, in terms of personal history, in terms of a family or an individual? Like, what is their particular world? So that happens in I think, all fiction. And in historical fiction, we're building that world out of little facts and things that we learn from our research, but they're knit together and presented to the reader through the lens of our imagination. So the opening line of this book, we're in the first chapter. This is before she's an orphan. She's with her family. Where are we in the world? The Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1919. If you have anything kind of in your mind as to an image or historical sense of that, you might think of a crowded street with laundry lines strung from one window to the next, and push carts full of vegetables or goods, and people crowded around, and fire escapes. That's pretty much where we are. You can always think about the scene sort of as a camera. Are we zooming out and like in through that one window and looking at this one family? But I wanted to start in the with the family, in their apartment. And I could have opened it and said the Rabinowitz family lived in a cramped tenement apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Totally fine. My opening sentence is, from her bed of bundled newspapers under the kitchen table, Rachel Rabinowitz watched her mother's bare feet shuffle to the sink. So very specific detail. We're a child, we're under a table, our bed is made of bundled newspapers. What about that specific concrete detail? The bundled newspapers I made up. I don't know. I don't think I ever read about that. But the idea that children would be sleeping in the kitchen of a tenement apartment, absolutely accurate. In a lot of ways, this entire first chapter of my novel is set at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in Manhattan. And I went there. They have a tenement building, a couple of buildings now preserved. They give tours. I was able to physically put myself in this space. If that is something available to you, I can't recommend it enough. Anytime you can physically put yourself in a space, even if you're writing about an ancient time, if it's available for you to travel to that place on the planet and get a sense of the topography or the light or the landscape from your own point of view, that's amazing. But that's not available to all of us, and it takes an incredible amount of time and money. Can you watch something? Is there a documentary? Is there a photograph book? Is there anything that will give you access to experiencing something as much for yourself as possible, so that the way you describe it is up to you? It's your decision. You've integrated what you've learned about the place, and now you're going to present it to the reader uniquely, because each of our perspectives on these stories is unique. So I really wanted to start, we're in this kitchen, and trusting my reader that they will stick with me for a couple of pages, even if they're not exactly sure where are we in time and place. In Orphan Number 8, it's just chapter 1. It doesn't say where we are. If you read the back of the book jacket, you get a better sense, but maybe not. Maybe someone's just diving in. In my first drafts, I often am explaining everything before I let myself start the story, and then that gets deleted later. I need to trust my reader that they're going to stick with me for a couple of pages as this world is built around them. And it's okay for the reader to be curious, for the reader to even be a little confused, as long as that confusion gets cleared up. It's a really nice way of being engaged in historical fiction. Like, where are we? How will this detail pay off? How is this apartment set up? Like, who are these people walking in and out the door? It really engages the reader, and as long as everything will be revealed within the book, within the chapter, within the scene, I would say, one thing I would share from my experience as a writer, you don't need to explain everything first. Rachel Rabinowitz is a little girl. She sleeps under the kitchen table. Her bed is made out of bundled newspapers. Her mom is shuffling across the floor. Okay. What else happens in this world? The next detail they'll encounter in terms of the world we're in, Rachel's mother drops a nickel in the gas meter. This is a detail I learned from visiting the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. You didn't have an account with the gas company and get a bill once a month. You had to put the coin in for the gas to come on, and it only lasted as long as whatever that coin was worth. Okay, so nickel in the gas meter. And now, as the page goes on, her mother looks under the table and says, "Stay put until the boarders leave for work." Boarders, what are we talking about? Why are there boarders? What do we even really mean by that term? Let's be curious for a minute. We don't need to explain it. And within a couple of paragraphs, Visha, that's Rachel's mother, knocks on the front room door. So we're like, okay, we're in a kitchen, and now there's a front room. There's a door between them. I'm weirdly obsessed with doors, and so I have to edit out in every scene I write. I'm always like, people are opening doors, closing doors, going through doors. I'm I'm just too obsessed with doors. So I edit that out a lot. But here she's knocking on the front room door. That's an aside. Sorry about that. After hearing the boarders' muffled voices assure her they were awake, she crossed the kitchen. So, okay, there's a kitchen, there's a front room. We knock on the door. The boarders say, "We're awake." And it's like, okay, the boarders are people who are in this front room for some reason. Visha, the mom, goes down the tenement hallway to use the toilet on page 2. We're not really used to thinking that our toilets are not inside our apartments. And this is a very common specific detail of the way tenement apartments were constructed. That all the sewer plumbing, often it was added later anyway, depending on when the building was first constructed. I think it was 1911, there was a housing law passed that you had to have actual toilets in your building and not just outhouses behind them. So often the hallways were just, in the hallway there'd be a couple of toilet stalls, and they were just stacked on each other through the whole building and not in each apartment. So that's pretty specific detail of this world. How are we maneuvering through this physical space now? We know there's a kitchen, there's a front room, there's a hallway, there are toilets down there. We're back in the kitchen. Page 2, she's boiling water and filling the basin in the sink. The water doesn't come hot out of the tap. If you want hot water, you have to pay for the gas to boil that water to make it hot. So just these little physical details of living in this space, in this world. On the table, she sets out breakfast, teapot, cups, a jar of jelly, a spoon. They end up stirring the jelly into their tea. I think I learned this from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. It's a really specific little detail that I picked up from reading something written at that time period. How do you sweeten things? Maybe you're not just buying sugar. So again, it stuck with me because it's so specific. It's very tactile. It's really different than anything I would do. And so it really stuck with me. Now we're moving into the bedroom. So here's a third room. Started in the kitchen. There's a front room. That's where the boarders live. The There are two young men, Joe and Abe. They stay in the front room, apparently. Okay, and then they come in. They're expecting that Visha Rabinowitz, Rachel's mom, has washed their shirts and made them some breakfast. So it's like, okay, boarders, they're paying. It's like Airbnb-ish. 1919 version. And that was very common, and in fact, a detail that I learned from my own family history when my great-grandparents were living on Henry Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. In the census, it listed that they had two boarders. So I know now this is only a 3-room apartment. If you're renting your couch out to a couple of young men, recently arrived immigrants, probably in my family history, most likely Jews from Eastern Europe, they're paying you a little bit to sleep in your house and get fed. You have your kitchen and you have a bedroom. Well, then where would your kids sleep that leaves the kitchen? And if you don't want to trip over their little cots, maybe you put the kids under the kitchen table. So this is how that world in this particular scene was built in my imagination. So Visha goes into her bedroom. She begins thinking about someday moving out of this tenement. So top of page 2, the tenement, you go down the tenement hallway to use the toilet. The first time I use the word tenement. And now on page 3, she's thinking about maybe we'll move up to Harlem or the Bronx. So we're like, okay, we now are getting a really strong sense, even if you didn't read the back of the book, Jacket, where we sort of are in the world. New York City, tenement, apartment. We have a sense of the world we're in. I'm not any further out into the world than this. We're still just in this one apartment. She talks about on page 3 that the stinking air shaft that you can actually hear your neighbors through, because the tenements, you have maybe windows in the front of the building, and they're just, all the apartments are lined up, and so to get the mandated sort of air circulation, the tenements, they call dumbbells, because if you look down on them from the sky, they look like a dumbbell, little indents where you'd have windows, but they didn't look anywhere. They were just windows across from one another over a shaft, and over the years, things would get dumped down that shaft or fall down that shaft, or animals would die at the bottom of that shaft, so they were disgusting. So again, a little detail, not explaining it. It's just Visha's thinking about, like, next door, how I can hear my neighbors in the air shaft. So we get that aspect of the world just as the story unfolds. We're soaking our bread in the tea because it's stale, because she can't afford fresh bread. The scene continues. Rachel's little brother, Sam, or her big brother, Sam, wakes up, and he's like trying to keep her occupied, so she stays under the table and out of the way. Visha gets nervous when there's too many people crowding in the kitchen. This is not a big space. The room I'm sitting in right now is probably half the size of their entire apartment. The top of page 5 is a little detail. Again, this is something I picked up, I think, from reading in the time period. Visha made Sam a dinner of pasta with tomato gravy, like Mrs. Giovanni, their neighbor. And just the little fact of calling what I would call tomato sauce. Like, of course, it's tomato sauce. But at the time, people would say tomato gravy. And it just one of those little things that I really liked because it's different. And it gives, I think, a sense of we're in a slightly different world. Visha makes lunch. Everybody gets a cold baked potato and a pickle. I don't know if that's a very common lunch, but potatoes are pretty cheap. In this particular tenement, as you'll see in a couple of pages, there's a pickle store on the first floor, and the pickle man usually gives Visha an extra pickle, so this is a cheap thing for her. It's food. You wrap it up in newspaper, put it in your pocket, and you've got something to eat. So I made that up. But, it's sitting right next to this tomato gravy, which was a real thing I read about. And that's kind of the effect I'm hoping to achieve. Everything seems like or feels like it could have really been that way. So our world continues. At Visha's husband, Harry, Rachel and Sam's dad, Harry, he wakes up and Visha makes him an egg, boils an egg. And it's a big deal in this world for her to make a whole egg just for one person every day, for her to have fresh egg to make for Harry. In the middle of page 6, it was a luxury, this, every morning a whole egg just for Harry. But he said he needed his strength. The syntax of that sentence, it was a luxury, this, every morning a whole egg. For me, I have access to a kind of syntax that reminds me of the way my grandma talked, the way my grandma and her friends talked, even the way my great-grandmother, who actually, I knew her too. She lived in this tenement on Henry Street. A kind of cadence to their talk, where even for my grandmother, for whom English was her first language, a kind of syntax that's coming from maybe Yiddish or something. It's just that little bit different, and I like that. I like that sort of flavor of that. But that's maybe a writing style thing. But it's coming through in the sentence about, this is a world in which an egg is a luxury. On page 7, we start to learn a little bit more about, what is the work of this world? So we have this physical place. We have a sense that money is a real issue. They're renting out their couch. She's worried about an egg. Their bread is already stale. The place where they live, you don't even get a toilet in your apartment. We are poor, but everybody in this building is the same. Everybody's working really hard. Many of the people are first generation, maybe second generation immigrants, or just arrived immigrants, working their way up, they hope, in America. So what is this work? And so on page 7, we get into this discussion of what is the work that we do in this world. And in this family, Harry is a cutter, Cutter. He's a cutter. And we learn about it through a conversation. Of course, on the one hand, you want to be careful not to use dialogue as a way of just explaining a bunch of stuff. If two characters come together, explain to me everything that's been happening lately. Okay, I will explain it to you in my dialogue, because that can feel really artificial for the reader. But I try, in this very short conversation, he's like, okay, they say, what are you cutting today, Papa, at work, at the factory? And he's like, okay, well, I got a pattern for the new shirtwaists yesterday. What is a shirtwaist? A shirtwaist is a garment, a blouse, but it's pretty long, and you tuck it into your skirt, and it's a little bit decorative, and it became affordable to mass-produce shirtwaists, and people could buy them in the store. Just working people could now afford to buy a blouse that maybe had a little lace or some pretty buttons, and have something that was very nice. We're not too far from a time when clothes were all handmade, and you did not have very many of them. But now we've come into an age. It's not that recent, garment factories and things, I think pretty common in America, even before the Civil War, through the Gilded Age. But the factories in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, particularly through the time period we think of as the Gilded Age, garment factories, a huge part of the economy, because you didn't have to pay. People would work very hard for very little, because it was better than where they came from. And you could now mass produce clothing in a way that you could sell for a price that a lot of working people could afford. So this is the world. Let me show you. I'm looking down again here. This is the book I read to write basically this paragraph and to inform this chapter. The World of Our Fathers, The Journey of Eastern European Jews to America and the Life They Found and Made by Irving Howe. This book, I read this whole book. And I had to let myself forget like all about it. Oh, the first drafts of this chapter were so long. Even the drafts I first gave to my editor were too long. So much got cut out of this chapter. And I'll get to that a little bit more in week 4 when we're like, what is the purpose of the chapter? What does the scene need to accomplish? And everything has to be in service to that, and things that don't serve that purpose are deleted. So I'm down to this one paragraph where we're explaining the shirtwaist industry and all this other stuff I just said. Harry says, the contractor, he likes my cutting because I don't leave much scrap. But the material for the new waists, that's what they would call the shirtwaist, a waist, has a little stitching running through the weave, and I had to lay out the pattern so that little stitch matched up at all the seams. Maybe that's a really strong image for the reader. Maybe it's a little bit hazy, depending on your own background. Is that something you can picture? Have you ever sewn anything? But hopefully it's enough information so you have a sense. We're in a garment factory. His job as a cutter is important because the contractor is paying for the fabric, and they want to get the most pieces of the pattern cut from the least amount of fabric, and that's Harry's job, is to figure that out. All right, so a whole lesson in the economy of the Lower East Side of Manhattan garment industry in a few sentences. On my page 8, Sam goes to work. Sam goes off to school and talks about clattering down 2 flights of stairs. Okay, now we know the apartment's on the 3rd floor. Visha goes into the front room to open the windows. The boarders are gone now for work. She saw a policeman still wearing his influenza mask, but Visha felt they were safe now the winter was over. Before we had our huge pandemic in 2020, the last time we thought about an influenza pandemic, we would go, I think most people, 1918 Spanish flu. And so right now it's the spring of 1919. This was a specific detail. People did wear masks. The past is always present. And for her to see a policeman still wearing his influenza mask, but she's feeling better because the winter is over, this tells us where we are in time, pretty specifically, spring of 1918. She sees Sam running off to school. She's looking down the window, dodging vendors' carts and motor cars and the milk truck's old horse. So just a quick sketch of that whole Lower East Side tenement street scene. Visha looks around the room. The front room, it's a mess. The boarders have left stuff all over. She has to tidy up because now it's their living room for the day. So again, just this sense of the world we're in. Little details like on page 10, I mentioned a transom over the door between the kitchen and the bedroom because the kitchen is in the middle. It has no windows. And so kind of legally it had to have some sort of access to fresh air. And so that would be over the transom through the windows, either to the air shaft in the bedroom or the front. The bottom, page 10, Harry's going off to work. He puts a fedora on his head. Could have put just a hat on his head, but finding just, again, that little tiny specific concrete detail that's going to keep your reader like, oh, I'm in a different world. Not that we don't use the word fedora today. I don't use it very often. On page 11, a dish has broken, and Visha says, oh, now I'll have to use the good one from my Seder dishes. We're a Jewish family. We have one set of dishes that's a little nicer. She keeps it up on a high shelf just for the Seder, for Passover. She takes the broken pieces of the plate that fell and puts them in a scrap bucket. We don't put things in a trash bin. We don't put things in a waste basket. Nothing is going to waste here. If there's a scrap of food, it's going in a soup. If there's a worn out piece of clothing, it's getting mended or turned into a quilt or adapted into some other, at least used as a rag. This was a time when people would be in the rag trade, and it was that actual business to just pick up what we would now, most of us consider garbage, and try to find a way to reuse or resell it. So we don't have a trash can, we have a scrap bucket. And maybe it is going to go into a trash, maybe it's going to be resold, but again, just this tiny vocabulary that reminds us we're in a different kind of place. On page 12, we have the scene with this insurance man. This is also comes to me from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Again, these people, hand to mouth, working really hard, getting paid the least amount that the factory owners can get away with paying them, scraping by, and trying so hard to save, trying so hard to move up in the world. So insurance, again, it's not something that you like sign up for and you get a bill in the mail and you pay it. No, there's a whole job. The insurance man, he comes around and gets a dime from you, and that's how you keep current. This person shows up. We also, on page 12, learn a little more about the pickle store on the first floor of the tenement building, where the pickle man tended barrels of brine and took in deliveries of cucumbers from a Long Island farmer. All the hallways of the building smelled of dill and garlic and vinegar. Really specific details of this world. We're going to go to the factory. We're taking a little, Visha and Rachel are going to go to the factory. Harry forgot his lunch at home. His cold potato and pickle. So on page 13, we get little glimpses of the world that they move through, going past the push carts, the streetcar. At the time, here's another thing that was written in the 1920s Manhattan Transfer by John Dos Passos. They just say the car. They don't say the streetcar, because what we would say now is just car is not as common. But I am going to use the word streetcar, otherwise my reader is going to think automobile. So an adjustment there, knowing that the term they would have used at the time is going to confuse my reader. It confused me. The whole thing about short waists and waists being blouses, I took a little moment to explain because it's pretty important in the scene. I think I say the streetcar passes, its hook sparking and snapping along the wire above, because I think that's a really cool detail, and that's all we need to know about streetcars. There's horse droppings, there's a truck with big rubber tires, there's a policeman at the intersection, we don't have stoplights. We get to the factory, there's a big elevator, a freight elevator with an operator. Elevators, I think until probably the 1950s or 60s, most elevators, there was a person's job was to be in that elevator and operate it. Like now, it's like you push a button, but it was a little more complicated than that. In the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the young man who was operating the freight elevator was like a hero who saved lives. The way he was able to get more of the women who were escaping that fire into the elevator, and I think he actually went back up and got other loads of women who were then able to escape that fire. Little aside there. On page 14, there's a description. So here, the thing I would point out about the paragraph on page 14 that starts, Visha led Rachel into the din of the factory. Description. We're not putting it into dialogue. We're not moving characters through it. We're not spending a lot of time at this factory. We're never coming really back to this factory in the whole novel. I want you to be able to see it and visualize it, but we're really only here because it's part of the story and we're moving the scene along. So here, description as economical as I could get it about the factory, the way the sewing machines work, The job runners deliver things, cloth. The women at the machines are called operators. There's young girls sewing buttons. But it's very compressed in this one paragraph description, narrative description. Just picture the scene enough so that some things can happen in it, but we're not going to explain, again, the whole history of the garment industry. A little detail of the world on page 15. When Visha and Rachel go to leave, the elevator opens. It was crowded with crates full of wispy bits of cloth. And the operator says, the scrap man's here. The elevator's full of scrap. Could you walk down? Again, that sense nothing is thrown away, really. On page 16, we're walking home. Again, a little bit of interaction with the bigger world, stopping at Broad Street at the butcher's. She gets a bone. She doesn't get a steak. She doesn't get hamburgers. She gets a bone. The bakery, she gets a yesterday's loaf. She's haggling over some carrots and potatoes. And then we stop at the pickle store. And we have a very fun experience at the pickle store. Why a pickle store? When I was a kid, there was a deli near my house, and we would stop by, and they had barrels of pickles, and getting one of those pickles out of that barrel and biting into it, like, one of the best things. So I just really liked that. Could have been statistically maybe more likely to have been a tavern, and the whole building would smell like beer. Whatever it was, most of the buildings had some sort of shop on the ground level or in the lower, almost basement level. And so whatever that store was, the whole place smelled like that. On page 17, again, little details about buttons. Rachel really likes, she can get herself worked up, and she's a little bit like prone to tantrums. And the thing that calms her down is like counting and sorting. And so her mom said, like, take this jar of buttons that Dad brought home from the factory and sort them all out. And so, again, these are just really tiny things. What were buttons made from then? And I researched that. So on page 17, we have mother of pearl, ivory, bone, tortoiseshell, jet, and horn. We don't have buttons made of plastic like the ones on the blouse I'm wearing. These are, so again, these little specific details that I think help give a flavor to the world. She's making dinner. She heats that bone until she can almost smell meat. Talks a little bit about the economy of their household, counting out their coins. Explains at the top of my page 18, what would it mean for Harry to move up in this garment industry? He needs to stop being a cutter for a contractor and get a contract for himself. Oh, here's the insurance man. I mentioned him earlier. I don't know what I'm looking at. Later, we start to get a sense of, some plot things happen. And we start to get a sense of the wider world of convents and orphanages, a little bit of a hint of things that are to come. And the last thing I would say about the world on the last page of the chapter 25, when Harry runs away, the policeman, he ran into the street and ducked into an alley before the policeman came from around the corner, whistle blowing. And again, we don't really, in these tenements, don't have telephones. So policemen are walking around, you run and find one, and then they come running if you need them. So these are some of the specific concrete details that I brought in from either my research, my experience, my imagination, little things that stuck with me. And again, everything that is not in that chapter. Because it needs to be a story that moves and not a history lesson about the garment industry. So those are the things that are building this world. The kind of physical space, the socioeconomic space through which my characters are moving, and in which the story will unfold. So that's the week one, and I'll be inviting you to think about really concrete, specific physical details that you are building your world out of before we move on to the next week. All right, see you in week two.